Rain fell over Whitechapel like judgment, hammering the cobblestones outside St. Jude's workhouse until the gutters ran black with soot and filth. It was the sort of November night that made a man button his coat to the throat and walk faster than he meant to, past the beggars huddled under sagging eaves, past the gin shops spilling yellow light onto the street. But Duke Alistair Ashwood did not walk fast. He walked slowly, deliberately, his dark wool cloak dragging through puddles, toward a door he had sworn he would never enter again. The workhouse smelled of boiled cabbage and unwashed bodies, of despair gone stale in the walls. A greasy lamp flickered above the overseer's desk, and behind it sat a thick, red-faced man named Mr. Grimsby, who did not so much as look up when Alistair entered. "I'm told you have a girl here," Alistair said, "one who does not speak." Grimsby's eyes narrowed with the particular greed of a man who smells money before he sees it. "We've plenty who don't speak, Your Grace. Speech don't feed itself in a place like this." This one, pale, scarred along the left temple, brought in some years back, no name, no kin. Alistair set his jaw. "I want her released into my care. That's irregular." Grimsby leaned back, letting the silence stretch, waiting for a number. "Girls like that belong to the parish. There's paperwork, fees, the matter of her keep these past." £10, Alistair said, and dropped a small leather purse onto the desk. The coins inside struck the wood with a sound like a verdict. In sovereigns. "Now fetch her, or I shall have my solicitor ask why a workhouse overseer is selling orphaned girls out the back door for gin money." Grimsby's hand closed over the purse before the threat had finished leaving Alistair's mouth. She was brought out a few minutes later by a matron who held her arm the way one might hold something already broken. The girl was perhaps 19, though hardship had aged her beyond her years. Thin as a reed, her workhouse smock hanging off narrow shoulders, her fair hair cropped short and ragged. A scar traced a pale line from her temple to her cheekbone, old and silvered, the kind left by a wound that had healed wrong. Her eyes were the strange part. They were sharp, watchful, not the vacant eyes of a girl who had given up, but the eyes of someone listening to a world she had decided, long ago, not to answer. "Iris," the matron said flatly, as though the name were simply a label stitched to a workhouse bundle. "She don't talk. Don't cry either, not even when she's beaten. Some say she's simple, others say she's just stubborn as a mule." Alistair studied her a moment longer than was polite. Something about the set of her jaw, the way she held herself apart even in rags, struck him as entirely wrong for that word. Simple. He removed his heavy tweed overcoat and stepped forward. "Miss Iris," he said gently, "you are coming with me. No one here will trouble you again." She flinched at the courtesy, as if kindness itself were a kind of trap she had learned to distrust. But she did not resist, as he settled the coat around her shivering shoulders. It swallowed her whole, sleeves hanging past her fingertips, and for one unguarded moment, her sharp eyes softened into something almost like disbelief. Outside, his handsome cab waited beneath a guttering street lamp, the horse stamping impatiently against the cold. Alistair handed her up into the carriage himself, and as the door shut behind them, and the wheels began to clatter over wet stone, he allowed himself, at last, to breathe. It was grief that had brought him here, though he would not have said so aloud. His younger sister, Eleanor, had died of a fever the previous spring, and in the long, hollow months since, Alistair had found himself drawn to the city's forgotten corners, workhouses, almshouses, the places where the desperate were quietly discarded, as though he might, in saving some stranger, undo what he had failed to save in his own house. He told himself this was Charity. He did not yet know it was fate wearing Charity's coat. He reached into his waistcoat pocket and drew out a small silver watch, worn smooth from years of handling. He opened it absently, the way a man touches an old wound to see if it still aches, and the carriage lamp caught the miniature portrait fixed inside the case, a young woman with fair curls and a soft, laughing mouth. Eleanor, painted the year before she died. Beside him, Iris went utterly still. Then she moved, quick, startling, her thin hand darting out to touch the glass casing with trembling fingers, as though she could not quite believe what she was seeing. Alistair's breath caught. In 3 years of silence recorded in the workhouse ledgers, in a lifetime of never once speaking her own name, Iris lifted her eyes to his, and she spoke. One word, barely more than a breath, cracked and rusted from disuse, but unmistakable all the same. Ali. The carriage rattled on through the rain. Alistair sat frozen, the watch still open in his hand, staring at a girl he had met not 20 minutes ago, a girl the workhouse called mute, called damaged, called nothing at all, who had just called him by the private nickname no one alive was supposed to know. Sleep did not come to Alistair that night. He sat by the fire in his London townhouse until the coals burned to ash, turning the watch over in his hands, turning her single word over in his mind. Ali. No servant used it. No creditor, no acquaintance from his club, no distant cousin at a dinner party had ever once stumbled upon it. Only Eleanor had called him that, and their mother before her, and both were long past speaking anything at all. By morning, he had made up his mind. Whatever answers existed, they would not be found by staring into a dying fire. He would take Iris home to Ashwood. Paddington Station at dawn was a churn of steam and shouting porters, trunks stacked like siege walls, a guard's whistle cutting through the noise every few minutes. Alistair had arranged a private first-class carriage, and Iris walked beside him through the crowd in a modest, dark wool traveling dress his housekeeper had sent over the previous evening. Plain, high-collared, nothing like the rags she had worn out of St. Jude's, yet she still moved through the station as though bracing for someone to snatch it from her. Once the train pulled clear of the city and the soot-stained rooftops gave way to hedgerows and pasture, she seemed to exhale for the first time. She pressed her palm flat against the window glass and watched Middlesex slide past in shades of gray and green, her scarred temple catching the weak morning light. Alistair had rehearsed his question a dozen times overnight, and still it came out clumsy. Iris. He waited until she turned from the window. Last night, in the carriage, you spoke a word, a name. I must know how you came to know it. Her face changed at once, the openness of the morning shuttering, closed like a window latched against weather. Her hands, folded in her lap, began to twist the fabric of her skirt. I mean you no harm by asking, he said, gentler now. Only, that name belonged to my sister alone. She died last spring. I have not heard it spoken since. Something crossed her expression at the word died. Not surprise, he thought, but a kind of recognition, as though grief were a language she already spoke fluently. Her breathing quickened, her lips parted, trembled, and closed again without sound. Whatever door had opened in the carriage the night before had shut itself once more, and no amount of gentleness on his part seemed able to force it back. She did not weep, and she did not speak. She simply sat very still, the way he imagined a hare sits still in tall grass when it hears the fox. Alistair let the silence hold. He had learned, in the long months since Eleanor's death, that grief could not be reasoned with, only waited out, and he suspected the same was true of whatever had broken this girl's voice, for 3 long years. Pressing her further would gain him nothing but her retreat. Near Reading, she reached instead for the small writing case his housekeeper had packed among her things. A plain wooden box holding a stub of graphite, a few sheets of paper, and a folding traveling inkpot. Her fingers, thin and quick, despite their tremor, uncapped the ink and began to write. Alistair watched, his pulse loud in his own ears, half expecting a confession, a name, an explanation that would settle the matter cleanly. Instead, when she turned the paper toward him, there was only a date. 14 October, 1872. He stared at the numbers as though they might rearrange themselves into something less troubling. They did not. "You're certain," he said quietly. It was not truly a question. Iris nodded once, her eyes fixed on his face, watching for whatever his own expression might betray. Alistair sat back against the velvet cushions, and for a long moment the only sound was the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the rails. He knew that date, the way a man knows the date of his own birth, though he had spent 10 years trying to forget it. On the 14th of October, 1872, his tutor, Mr. Arthur Vance, had vanished along with his entire family, a wife and a young daughter, when the carriage carrying them across a flooded stretch of the River Avon had gone over the parapet of a stone bridge in the night. The bridge had been weakened by weeks of autumn rain. The bodies, the county coroner had reported at the time, were never recovered from the current. Alistair had been 14 years old. Mr. Vance had been more than a tutor to him, patient where Alistair's own father was cold, encouraging where his father was exacting. The man had taught him Latin and mathematics in the Manor's East study, had taken him fishing along the very river that later swallowed him whole. His daughter, a fair-haired girl a year or two younger than Alistair, used to sit at the edge of those lessons with a slate of her own, mouthing the Latin words after them like a small, solemn echo. He had not thought of her name in a decade. He found now that he could not quite recall it, only the shape of her, small, quiet, watchful, sitting in the corner of a room that no longer existed in the same form, in a house he had not set foot in as a boy without her. He looked again at the young woman across from him, at the scar along her temple, old enough now to have faded to silver, exactly the sort of mark a girl might carry away from a carriage that struck stone and water in the dark. At the way she watched him now, guarded and afraid, as though she had just handed him a truth too dangerous to be spoken aloud in words, and had chosen ink instead because ink could be denied. "Mr. Vance," he said carefully, testing the name the way one tests ice before crossing it. "Arthur Vance." Was he? Iris's hand closed over his on the seat between them, quick and sudden, her grip startlingly strong for something so thin. She did not answer. She only held on, as the train carried them both west, toward Wiltshire, toward Ashwood Manor, toward a house full of a dead man's belongings that no one had touched in 10 years. Ashwood Manor rose out of the Wiltshire mist like something remembered rather than seen. Gray stone softened by ivy, tall windows catching the last thin light of a Thursday afternoon, ancient oaks standing sentinel along the carriage drive. Iris pressed close to the window as the house came into view, her breath fogging the glass, and Alistair watched her rather than the house he had known his whole life. He was searching her face for some flicker of recognition, some sign that this place, too, lived somewhere behind her silence. If it did, she gave nothing away. Only her hand, resting on the seat beside his, tightened once as the wheels turned onto the gravel sweep. Mrs. Danvers was waiting at the top of the entrance steps before the carriage had fully stopped, her keys jangling at her waist, as they always did, her expression arranging itself into careful neutrality the moment she caught sight of the pale young woman descending after the Duke. 30 years in service at Ashwood had taught her not to question what her master brought home, only to prepare for it. "Your Grace," she dropped a small curtsy. "We've had the fires lit in the blue rooms as you instructed." "Not the blue rooms," Alistair said. "The south wing. The chambers that catch the morning sun." Mrs. Danvers' composure slipped for the briefest moment. The south wing had stood empty and dust-sheeted since Eleanor's death, its rooms among the finest guest quarters in the house, reserved in the old days for visiting relations of consequence. "The south wing, Your Grace," she repeated, recovering herself. "And she is to be treated as a guest of this house, Mrs. Danvers, not a servant, not a charge, not an object of curiosity among the staff. See that it is understood." "Of course, Your Grace." Something in the housekeeper's eyes softened as she looked at Iris properly for the first time, at the thin wrists, the guarded posture, the scar catching the gray afternoon light, and whatever judgment she had carried up the steps with her seemed to loosen. "This way, miss. You'll want to warm yourself before supper." Iris did not move at once. She stood on the gravel, looking up at the manor's gray facade, at the rows of mullioned windows, at the great oak door standing open to receive her, and Alistair saw something pass behind her eyes that was not quite memory and not quite fear, but some uneasy country between the two. She followed the housekeeper inside without a word. That evening, after Iris had been settled and fed, and Mrs. Danvers had reported her, with some wonder, to have eaten a full supper for the first time since her arrival, Alistair found himself alone in the drawing-room with a decision he had been putting off since Reading. In the far corner of the room stood a locked oak cabinet, tall and plain, unremarkable enough that most visitors passed it without a second glance. Alistair had not opened it in 10 years. He crossed to it now, drew the small brass key from where it hung on his watch chain alongside Eleanor's portrait, and turned it in the lock. The hinges complained as the doors swung open. Inside, undisturbed since the autumn of 1872, sat the modest belongings of a man the county had long since given up for drowned. A set of worn Latin primers, a folding writing desk, a pair of spectacles in a battered case, and, near the back, a leather-bound journal embossed with a small, faded crest, a hawk in flight over a bar of 3 stars, the mark of the Vance family, minor gentry from Somerset, who had held little beyond their name and their pride. He was still deciding whether to send for Iris or wait until morning when he heard the drawing-room door open behind him. She stood in the doorway in her nightclothes and a borrowed shawl, drawn there, he supposed, by something in the house itself, some instinct, older than memory, some pull toward a room she should not have been able to find on her own in a house she had never once visited. Her eyes found the cabinet immediately, found the journal in his hands. "Iris," he said carefully, "I believe this belonged to your father." She crossed the room slowly, as though the floor might give way beneath her, and took the journal from his hands with the reverence of someone handling a relic. Her fingers traced the raised lines of the crest, the hawk, the 3 stars, and her breath caught audibly in the quiet room. She opened the cover. Inside, in a neat, careful hand, quite unlike her own trembling script, was written, A. Vance, his book, Ashwood, 1871. The tears came without sound, as everything about her came without sound. No sobbing, no gasping, only a slow, silent overflow down her scarred cheek as she stood holding the last physical proof that her father had once been a living man in a living house, rather than a name lost to a flooded river a decade past. Alistair did not know he had moved until his hand was already resting over hers, steadying the journal between them. He felt, beneath his palm, the fine tremor running through her whole body, and something in his chest answered it. Not pity, which he had expected to feel for a girl so wounded, but something closer to recognition, as though her grief and his own had been carved from the same stone and had only now, in this dim firelit room, found each other again. "You are safe here," he said quietly. "Whatever happened to you, whatever you cannot yet say, you need not carry it alone any longer." She did not answer in words. She only turned her hand beneath his and gripped his fingers, hard, the way a person grips a rail at the edge of a cliff, and Alistair understood, with a certainty that unsettled him more than any workhouse confession could have, that he had made her a promise he intended to keep for the rest of his life, whatever the cost of keeping it turned out to be. Word travels fast among the great houses of Wiltshire, faster still when the word concerns a workhouse girl taken into a duke's home. By the following Monday, Lord Julian Ashwood had heard enough whispered gossip at his London club to abandon whatever business kept him there and arrive at the manor unannounced, his traveling coach rattling up the drive an hour before noon with his valet, Mr. Pratt, perched stiffly beside the driver. Alistair met his cousin in the entrance hall with the particular weariness of a man greeting a storm he had known was coming. "Julian, you might have sent word." And spoil the surprise, Julian handed off his hat and gloves without looking at the footman who received them, his sharp eyes already sweeping the hall as though searching for evidence of scandal in the very wallpaper. He was a handsome man, in the way a well-kept blade is handsome, all polish, no warmth, and next in line to the Ashwood dukedom should Alistair die without issue, a fact he never quite managed to forget. "I hear you've brought home a stray from some London workhouse. The whole county is talking of nothing else. Her name is Iris." Iris. Julian said the name as though tasting something sour. "Charming. And what precisely is her claim on this house? Cousin, companion, ward, or something rather less respectable?" "She is a guest," Alistair said, "and you will treat her as such." Julian's smile did not reach his eyes. "Of course." Tea was laid that afternoon in the glass conservatory, where pale winter sun filtered through panes, fogged with condensation, and the last of the season's hothouse roses drooped in their pots. Iris sat stiffly beside Alistair in a borrowed gown of soft grey wool, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and Alistair noted, with some relief, that 3 days at Ashwood had already put a little color back into her cheeks. Julian watched her over the rim of his teacup the way a man watches something he suspects of being counterfeit. "You don't speak much. I understand," he said, his tone pleasant, poisonous. "Or is it that you can't? The servants below stairs seem to have quite opposing theories." Iris's eyes flicked to her lap. Alistair felt his own jaw tighten. "Julian, I only mean to be neighborly." Julian set down his cup with a small, deliberate click against its saucer. "It's simply remarkable, is it not, how quickly some people learn the value of a well-timed silence. A mute girl from a workhouse, brought into a duke's home, given the finest chambers, dressed like a lady of quality. One can hardly blame the county for wondering whether the silence is quite so involuntary as it appears. Grief makes a man generous, and generosity, I've observed, has a way of finding the most convenient objects." "That is enough," Alistair said, low and sharp. But Julian was not finished. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to something almost confiding, almost cruel in its softness. "Tell me, miss, did you learn your manners in the workhouse laundry, or does St. Jude's train its witless street vagrants in etiquette these days as well?" Iris rose so suddenly that her chair scraped against the tiled floor, and in rising, she caught the edge of the tea table with her sleeve. Her cup toppled, spilling a dark stain across the white cloth, and for one frozen moment, the whole room seemed to hold its breath around the small disaster. Then she was moving. Past the wicker chairs, past the startled maid at the conservatory door, out through the glass, and into the gardens beyond, where a fine gray mist hung low over the rose beds and the gravel paths wound away into the fog. Alistair rounded on his cousin before the door had fully swung shut behind her. "You will not speak to her in that manner again, not in this house, not anywhere within 100 miles of it. I spoke only the truth. Others are too polite to say aloud." Julian did not so much as flinch under his cousin's temper. He had weathered worse from harder men. "You bring a nameless girl into Ashwood and expect the county to simply accept her as, what, exactly? A guest of quality? Alistair, think what you're doing. Grief has clouded your judgment since Eleanor died, and this girl, leave my sister out of your mouth." Alistair's voice had gone very quiet, which was, to anyone who knew him, considerably more dangerous than shouting. "You will apologize to Iris before you leave this house, or you will not be welcome in it again. That is not a threat, Julian. It is a certainty." He did not wait for an answer. He left his cousin standing among the ruined tea things and went out through the conservatory door into the gardens, following the faint scuff of footprints in the damp gravel until he found her beneath the old stone pavilion at the garden's far end, half hidden behind a curtain of dead climbing roses. She was not crying. He had begun to understand, in these few days, that Iris rarely cried where anyone might see. But she sat with her knees drawn up and her arms wrapped tight around them, her whole body drawn small, the posture of someone who had spent years making herself as invisible as possible in rooms full of people who despised her. "Iris?" He sat beside her on the cold stone bench, not touching her, giving her the space she seemed to need. "My cousin is a small, bitter man who fears losing what he believes should be his." Nothing he said was true, not one word of it. She did not look at him. But after a long moment, her hand found his sleeve and held it, the way a person holds onto something solid in a boat that has begun to rock, and they sat together beneath the dripping roses while the mist thickened around them and the distant sound of Julian's coach, at last, rattled away down the drive. Thunder rolled over Wiltshire on the last Friday of the month, rattling the tall windows of Ashwood Manor until the very glass seemed to hum with each fresh crack of lightning. Alistair had gone to bed at 11 and abandoned the attempt an hour later, too restless for sleep, his mind turning over the same unanswered questions it had turned over every night for 2 weeks. The date on that scrap of paper, the crest on the journal, the word she had whispered in the carriage that had started it all. He found the library candlelit when he came downstairs for a book to occupy his wakeful hours, and Iris already there before him. She sat curled in the great leather armchair beside the hearth, a blanket drawn over her knees. The fire burned down to a deep orange glow that threw long shadows across the shelves. Spread on the low table before her lay a scatter of old county maps and parish records, pulled from the library's lower archives. Survey lines of the River Avon, faded ink marking the stone bridge at Compton Weir, a coroner's report yellowed with age. She had been reading by firelight for some time, judging by the careful stack of documents she had already set aside. "You should be asleep," Alistair said gently, though he made no move to leave. She glanced up, unsurprised by his presence, and shifted slightly to make room on the wide hearthrug beside her chair. It was invitation enough. He settled there, the fire warm against his side, and for a while neither of them spoke, watching the flames gutter and spark, while the storm worked itself into a fury against the windows. It was the thunder, he thought afterward, that did it. A great crack of lightning split the sky directly over the manor, close enough that the whole room flashed white before the boom of thunder followed almost instantly behind, and Iris flinched so violently that the map slid from her lap onto the floor. Her hands flew to her ears. Her breathing came fast and shallow, her eyes wide and fixed on nothing, and Alistair recognized, with a cold lurch of understanding, that she was no longer entirely in the room with him. Iris, he knelt before her chair, taking her trembling hands gently away from her ears, holding them steady in his own. Iris, you are here. You are at Ashwood. You are safe. For a long moment she said nothing, her chest heaving, her eyes still distant with whatever storm inside her memory had answered the one outside the window. Then, slowly, her gaze cleared and fixed on his face, and her lips parted. The water was so cold, Ali. Her voice came rasping and raw, unpracticed after years of disuse, but whole, a full sentence, soft and broken and entirely her own. Alistair went very still, afraid that any movement, any sound, might frighten the words back into silence. "Tell me," he said quietly, "whatever you remember. I am listening." And so, haltingly, with long pauses where her voice seemed to fail her and had to be coaxed back with nothing more than his patient silence, Iris told him. She remembered the carriage first, the swaying of it, the rain drumming on the roof, her mother's hand gripping hers too tightly in the dark. She remembered her father's voice, raised sharp with alarm as the horses balked at the bridge, the sudden violent lurch as the wheel struck stone, and then the water, black and roaring and impossibly cold, closing over her head. She remembered nothing after that but fragments. A fisherman's hands pulling her from the shallows further downstream where the current had carried her, half drowned and already fevered from the blow to her temple that had opened the wound now scarred silver above her eye. She did not know how long the fever lasted, only that when it broke, she remembered her own name for a single day, spoke it once to the fisherman's wife who had nursed her, and then lost it entirely, along with every other word, as though the river had taken her voice along with her family and simply forgotten to give it back. The parish did not know what to do with a nameless girl who could not speak, she said, each word still costing her visible effort. They sent me to the workhouse. I learned, there, that silence was safer than speech. The ones who cried out were punished worse. The ones who fought were punished worst of all. So I said nothing. For years, I said nothing to anyone, and it was easier that way. Easier to be thought simple than to be thought difficult. And my sister's watch, Alistair said softly. How did you know to speak my name? Iris shook her head slowly, tears standing unshed in her eyes. I do not know. Something in me knew you before I knew why. Your face, your voice. It was like a door I had forgotten was ever in the house, and it simply opened. Alistair knelt there before the fire with her cold hands wrapped in his, and he thought of his old tutor's patient voice reading Latin verbs aloud in the East study, of the small, fair-haired girl who used to sit in the corner mouthing the words after them, and he understood, with a certainty that settled into his chest like something long overdue, exactly who it was he held before him. Your suffering is over, he said. I promise you that, Iris, whatever it costs me, whatever the county says, whatever my cousin schemes, you will never again be nameless, and you will never again be silenced by anyone's cruelty, not while I draw breath. She did not answer in words this time. She only leaned forward, resting her forehead against his shoulder, and outside the thunder rolled away southward, over the hills, leaving only the steady drum of rain and the low crackle of the dying fire to fill the quiet that settled, at last, comfortably between them. 3 weeks passed, in a kind of fragile peace. Iris's voice returned to her slowly, like water finding its way back into a dry riverbed. A sentence here, a question there, whole conversations by the second week, though she still fell silent for hours at a time when the house grew too quiet or the weather turned rough. Alistair had begun, without quite admitting it to himself, to arrange his days around the small pleasure of hearing her speak. The peace ended on a cold Thursday morning with the sound of a second carriage on the drive. Julian arrived this time with rather more than his valet. A local magistrate, Mr. Holloway, sat beside him in the coach, his official manner already composed before his boots touched the gravel, and Julian himself wore the particular satisfaction of a man who believes he has finally been dealt a winning hand. Cousin, Julian did not wait to be received in the drawing room. He strode straight in, Holloway trailing behind him with a leather folio under his arm. "I regret the intrusion, but the matter admits no delay. My mother's sapphire and diamond brooch, an Ashwood heirloom promised to her by your late uncle, has gone missing from her rooms at Hartwell. I have reason to believe it was taken by a member of this household during her visit here last month." Alistair's blood went cold, though his face betrayed nothing. "You are mistaken. No such theft has occurred under my roof." "Then you will have no objection," Julian said smoothly, "to Mr. Holloway conducting a search of the guest quarters. Purely to clear the matter, of course, and to spare your household any lingering suspicion. There was nothing to be done but permit it. To refuse would itself look like guilt, and Alistair knew Julian well enough to understand the trap had already been set before the coach ever left London. He followed the magistrate and his cousin up the great staircase to the south wing with a dread settling in his chest that he could not entirely name, and it was there, in Iris's own wardrobe, tucked beneath a folded shawl at the very back of the lowest shelf, that Pratt, Julian's valet, conveniently present to assist the search, drew out a small velvet box. Inside lay the brooch, sapphires and diamonds catching the gray morning light, exactly as Julian had described it, wrapped in a scrap of cloth, as though someone had hidden it there in haste. There, Julian's voice carried a note of triumph he did not trouble to disguise. "Precisely as I feared." Iris, summoned from the library to stand in the doorway of her own chambers, stared at the brooch in the magistrate's hands, as though it belonged to some language she had never learned to read. Her face drained of color. Her hands began to shake, the old workhouse stillness dropping over her like a shroud, and Alistair watched with mounting horror as 3 weeks of hard-won speech dissolved back into silence right before him. Not from guilt, he was certain, but from the sheer terror of a girl who had spent years learning that accusation, once made, could never be argued away by someone with no name and no standing to argue it. "This is a mistake," Alistair said. "Iris has not left this house in weeks. She has never so much as met your mother. And yet the brooch is found in her wardrobe," Holloway said, not unkindly, but with the flat weight of procedure behind his words. "Your Grace, I understand your fondness for the young woman, but I have a duty to perform. Theft of an heirloom of this value is no small matter. I must place her under arrest pending formal charges." He produced, from his coat, a set of iron wrist cuffs, and it was the sight of them, cold, deliberate, exactly the sort of restraint a workhouse matron might have used on a girl who dared to weep too loudly, that seemed to break whatever composure Iris had been clinging to. She shrank back against the doorframe, her whole body trembling, her mouth opening and closing on words that refused to come, and Alistair understood, watching her, that she had gone somewhere far away in her own mind, some cold, dark place where the water closed over her head all over again, and no one was coming to pull her out. Julian watched his cousin's face with quiet satisfaction, as though the girl's silence were confirmation enough of everything he had hoped to prove. "Come now, Alistair. Even you must see it." An innocent woman would protest. She would weep, she would plead, she says nothing at all, because there is nothing honest left to say. "She says nothing," Alistair said, his voice shaking now with a fury he had rarely allowed himself in his own house, because for years the only lesson this world has troubled to teach her is that speaking earns punishment and silence earns survival. "If you had spent one day of your comfortable life in the place she came from, Julian, you would understand that her silence is not confession. It is scar tissue." He crossed the room and placed himself bodily between Iris and the magistrate's approaching hands, his voice dropping into something cold and final that Mrs. Danvers, listening from the corridor, would later describe to the kitchen staff as a tone she had never once heard her master use in 30 years of service. "You will not touch her, not in my house, not on my land, and not without evidence that has passed through a proper court, rather than a private search, arranged by a man who stands to inherit everything I own, the moment she is proven to have any lawful claim upon this family. Think carefully, Mr. Holloway, before you act on my cousin's word alone." The magistrate hesitated, the cuff still in his hand, uncertain footing opening beneath a case he had believed, until that moment, entirely settled. The silence that followed stretched taut across the room, broken only by the low crackle of the fire and Iris's ragged, uneven breathing. Mr. Holloway stood with the iron cuff still open in his hand, his composure wavering under the weight of a duke's cold fury and the sudden, uncomfortable awareness that he had walked into a dispute far older and far more personal than any missing brooch. "Your Grace," he said carefully, "I appreciate your position, but the evidence found in this room cannot simply be dismissed on your say-so." "Nor," Alistair replied, "can it be accepted on my cousin's say-so alone. I am not obstructing your duty, Mr. Holloway. I am insisting it be performed properly. If theft has occurred, let it be tried before a magistrate's court with full evidence heard, witnesses called, and the circumstances of this so-called discovery examined as closely as the girl herself. Until such a warrant is lawfully issued, you have no authority to remove anyone from my land, and I will not permit it." Julian's jaw tightened. "You would shield her from justice." "I would shield her from you," Alistair said. "Which experience has taught me is very often the same thing as justice, where you are concerned." Holloway, caught between a peer of the realm and a case built on evidence he had not himself uncovered, made the only choice a cautious man in his position could make. He withdrew the cuffs, informed the room stiffly that he would be obliged to report the matter to the county bench and return with a proper warrant if the evidence held, and took his leave, with Julian trailing after him, white with anger, and already muttering of solicitors and high court judges. The moment the coach wheels had faded down the drive, Alistair turned to find Iris exactly as she had been through the whole ordeal, pressed against the doorframe, silent, shaking, her eyes fixed on some middle distance that held nothing of the room around her. "Iris!" He crossed to her slowly, the way one approaches a frightened animal, and knelt so that his eyes were level with hers. "It's over. He's gone. You are not going anywhere in irons. Not today, not ever, while I have breath left to prevent it." Her eyes finally focused on his face, and what he saw there undid something in him more thoroughly than any of Julian's insults ever had. Not gratitude, but disbelief, as though the notion of a man standing between her and a cell was so foreign to everything her life had taught her that she could not yet trust it as real. "He will come back," she whispered. "Yes," Alistair said, because he would not lie to her, not even to comfort her. With a proper warrant this time, signed by the High Court, and enough of the county's gossip behind him to make my objections harder to sustain. "Julian is many things, Iris, but he is not stupid, and he does not lose patience with a scheme half so easily as he lost his temper today. Then what is to be done? We leave." He said it before he had fully finished deciding it, though the moment the words left him, he knew them for the only sensible course remaining. "Tonight, if we can manage it, I have a cottage on the Cornish coast, near St. Ives, remote, quiet, known to almost no one outside my own solicitors. We will go there while Mr. Finch investigates how a brooch that never left your wardrobe until this morning came to be found inside it. A planted stone is easier to disprove with time and distance than with a magistrate standing over your shoulder demanding immediate answers." He rose and went at once to find Mrs. Danvers, and within the hour the household had been set into a quiet, efficient motion entirely unlike the panic such a flight might have provoked in a lesser-run house. Trunks were packed with a fortnight's clothing. The carriage was readied and horses changed for the journey. Alistair wrote a brief, guarded letter to his solicitor, Mr. Finch, instructing him to begin discreet inquiries into the brooch's provenance and Julian's recent debts, and sealed it for delivery by the fastest post available. Iris said little as the household worked around her, watching from the window seat of her chamber as dusk gathered over the gardens where, weeks before, she had fled from Julian's cruelty into the mist. She had grown fond of this house in the short time she had known it, fond of the library fire, of Mrs. Danvers' gruff kindness, of the particular gray light that fell through the east study window where her father had once taught a young boy his Latin verbs. Leaving it felt, she confided quietly to Alistair as he came to fetch her, like being taken from a home twice in one lifetime, though this time, at least, she was not being taken from it alone. "It will not be forever," he promised, settling a traveling cloak about her shoulders, much as he had settled his overcoat about them the night he first found her. "Only until the truth can be proven, where Julian cannot bury it beneath a magistrate's convenient haste." The brougham carriage stood waiting in the courtyard by the time full dark had fallen, its lamps lit against the winter night, the horses restless in the cold. Alistair handed Iris up himself, as he had done outside St. Jude's, what felt now like a lifetime ago, and climbed in after her, rapping twice on the roof to signal the coachman. As the wheels turned onto the drive, and Ashwood Manor's gray bulk receded into darkness behind them, Iris reached for his hand without being asked, and Alistair understood that whatever came of Julian's scheme, whatever the High Court's warrant eventually demanded of him, he had already made his choice in that drawing-room, and had no intention now of unmaking it. They were bound for Cornwall, and whatever waited for them there, they would face it together or not at all. The cottage at St. Ives sat perched above the harbor on a shoulder of gray cliff, small and weathered, and entirely unlike the grandeur of Ashwood, a low stone house with a slate roof, salt-streaked windows, and a garden gone half wild with sea thrift and gorse. Alistair had inherited it from his mother's family years before and visited it rarely, more from sentiment than use, and it was precisely that emptiness, that distance from London gossip and Julian's schemes, that made it the safest place he could think to bring her. They arrived in the last week of December, the sky the color of pewter, gulls wheeling and crying over the harbor below. A local woman, Mrs. Trewin kept the place aired and provisioned on Alistair's occasional instruction, and she asked no questions about the pale young lady who arrived with the Duke, and no maid, only bobbed a curtsy and set about laying fires in the two best rooms without a word of curiosity spoken aloud. For the first time since St. Jude's, Iris slept through an entire night undisturbed. Their days settled quickly into a quiet, unhurried rhythm, quite unlike the tension of Ashwood in its final weeks. Mornings began with the crash of waves against the rocks below the cottage and the cry of gulls wheeling over the harbor. Alistair would find her often already awake, wrapped in a shawl at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold beside her, watching the gray water through the window as though she still could not quite trust that it would not one day rise up and claim her the way it had claimed her family a decade before. He began, without quite deciding to, walking with her along the cliff path each afternoon, not far, for the wind off the sea could be fierce and her strength was still returning after the ordeal at Ashwood, but far enough to reach the small cove where fishing boats sheltered from the worst of the weather, their hulls tarred black, nets drying on wooden frames along the shingle. "You are not afraid of it," Alistair observed one such afternoon, watching her stand close to the water's edge, close enough that the spray from a breaking wave caught the hem of her cloak. "I was afraid of it for 10 years, Iris said. Her voice had grown steadier by then, though it still carried the faint rasp of long disuse, a texture he had come to find he did not wish away, even could he have wished it. "I think I am tired of being afraid. The sea did not mean to take my family from me. It only did what the sea does. There is nothing in it to forgive, and nothing in it to fear, once you have made your peace with what it is." He thought, watching her, that he had rarely heard anyone speak of grief with such plain, unadorned wisdom, and he wondered how much of it she had earned in the workhouse's silent years, turning the same thoughts over and over, with no one to share them with, until they had worn themselves smooth as sea glass. In the evenings they sat by the small parlor fire, Iris with a book from the cottage's modest shelf, Alistair often simply watching her read, the firelight gilding the edge of her scarred temple, and he found himself, more nights than not, entirely unable to account for how the hours had passed. She had begun, in small ways, to tease him, a dry remark about his inability to properly bank a fire, a raised eyebrow at his hopeless attempts to help Mrs. Trewin in the kitchen, and each small flash of humor struck him as a kind of miracle, proof of a spirit. The workhouse and the river both had failed, after everything, to drown. It was on an evening near the middle of their stay, with a gale rattling the shutters and the fire burned low, that she asked him the question that had clearly been sitting unspoken between them for some time. "Do you remember me, Ali? Truly remember, not merely the sums adding up in your head, the bridge, the date, my father's crest. Do you remember me, the girl who used to sit in the corner of your lessons?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I remember a quiet girl with fair hair who mouthed the Latin after us and thought no one noticed. I remember being a little in awe of her, though I would never have admitted such a thing to a 14-year-old boy's pride. I did not know then that I was looking at someone who would one day walk back into my life out of a workhouse and turn it entirely upside down. You called me your hero once," Iris said quietly, "when we were little. Do you remember that? You had pulled me out of the mill pond after I fell in chasing a duckling, and I told my father you were the bravest boy I had ever known." "I do not remember the mill pond," he admitted, "though I confess I am rather fond of the story, now that I've heard it." "You were my hero then," she said, and her voice, though soft, did not waver. You are my hero now, Ali. You paid £10 for a girl the whole workhouse called damaged, and you have not once, in all these weeks, made me feel as though that description was ever true. It was never true, he said. It was never true of you, not for one single day, and I am only sorry it took the world so long to see it as plainly as I do. The fire had burned down to embers by the time either of them spoke again, and when Iris finally lifted her face to his, the firelight caught the old scar at her temple and the new, unguarded warmth in her eyes in equal measure, and Alistair found he could no longer pretend, even to himself, that what he felt for her belonged to memory or pity or the debt of an old tutor's kindness repaid. He kissed her there by the dying fire, gently, as though she were something he still feared to break, and she kissed him back with the quiet certainty of a girl who had finally, after 10 long years of silence, found something worth speaking for. The letter from Mr. Finch arrived in the second week of January, carried up from the harbour post office by Mrs. Trewin's grandson, and Alistair read it standing in the cottage doorway, with the wind off the sea tugging at the pages. Its contents were brief but urgent enough that he set off for London within the hour, leaving Iris with a promise to return inside 3 days and a look on his face that told her, more plainly than words, that whatever Finch had uncovered was worth the leaving. Lincoln's Inn stood grey and cramped beneath a low January sky, its narrow courts busy with black-robed clerks hurrying between chambers, and Mr. Finch's office, when Alistair reached it, smelled of old paper and pipe smoke, every surface stacked with the neat, precise disorder of a man who had spent 30 years managing other people's secrets. "Your Grace." Finch rose from behind his desk, a thin, grey-whiskered man with the careful manner of a solicitor who has learned never to deliver news, good or ill, without first ensuring his client is seated. "I believe we have found the thread that unravels the whole matter." Alistair sat. "Tell me." "I began, as you instructed, by tracing the brooch's recent history, who had access to Lady Ashwood's rooms at Hartwell in the weeks before the alleged theft, and whether any record existed of the piece leaving the family's possession before it was discovered here. What I found instead, Your Grace, was considerably more useful than a simple inventory." Finch drew a folder from the stack at his elbow, thick with correspondence and ledger copies. "Your cousin, Lord Julian, has been deeply in debt to a number of London bookmakers since at least the autumn of 1872. Gambling losses, principally, though there is also mention of an unwise investment in a shipping venture that failed disastrously that same year. The debts were substantial enough, by 1872, that 2 separate creditors had begun threatening legal action against him. Go on? It was in searching the records of that same autumn that I found this." Finch slid a single sheet across the desk, a copied ledger entry, dated the 17th of October, 1872, 3 days after the bridge collapse that had taken the Vance family. "A payment, Your Grace, £20, drawn from an account belonging to Lord Julian, paid to a Mr. Josiah Grimsby of St. Jude's Workhouse Parish. No description of the purpose is recorded, but the timing struck me as remarkable, given what I already knew of your household's recent history." Alistair went very still. "Grimsby?" "The overseer. The very same, Your Grace, though he was a younger man and held a lesser post at the time, an assistant to the overseer then in charge, promoted to his current position some years later. I made further inquiries, discreetly, through a former clerk of the parish, who owed me a favor from an entirely unrelated matter." He recalled, though only vaguely after so many years, a girl brought into St. Jude's that same autumn, found half-drowned and fevered near Compton Weir, taken in by a fisherman's family before being handed over to parish care when her memory failed to return. He recalled, too, some talk at the time of a gentleman's payment made to ensure the girl's presence in the workhouse was never formally recorded under her own name, nor connected to the Vance family's disappearance in the county's official inquest. He knew. Alistair's voice came out low, disbelieving, even as the pieces settled with sickening clarity into place. Julian knew Iris had survived. He knew who she was, and he paid to have her buried alive in a workhouse rather than see her found. I believe so, Your Grace, though I would counsel some caution in how we phrase the accusation until it can be properly proven in court. Consider the motive, however, and the matter becomes rather plain. Mr. Vance's estate, though modest, held a land entitlement tied to the original Ashwood settlement, a parcel granted to his family 2 generations back in exchange for certain services to your grandfather, with a clause stipulating its reversion to Vance heirs should any surviving descendant come forward within a defined term of years. Should Iris's identity as Arthur Vance's daughter ever be proven, that land reverts to her, along with certain mineral rights your cousin has, I discovered, already quietly begun negotiating to lease to a mining concern near Bath. He stands to lose a considerable fortune the moment her claim is established, a fortune he badly needs, given his debts, and a fortune he clearly believed a fever-addled, memory-lost workhouse girl would never live to reclaim. Alistair sat back in his chair, the full architecture of his cousin's cruelty spreading out before him, with a coldness that made his hands curl into fists against his knees. 10 years. 10 years of silence and cruelty and workhouse walls, all of it engineered not by chance or misfortune, but by a man's calculated fear of losing money he had already gambled away twice over. And the brooch, he said slowly, it was never stolen at all. I suspect not, Your Grace. I believe it more likely that Lord Julian arranged to have it planted precisely as it was found, calculating that a theft charge would either see Miss Vance removed from your protection entirely or discredit her so thoroughly in the county's eyes that any future claim to the Vance land would never be taken seriously by a court. A convicted thief makes a poor claimant to an inheritance, Your Grace, whatever the truth of her birth. Alistair rose from his chair, the folder of evidence gripped tight in his hand. 10 years of quiet grief hardening into something considerably more useful. Then we shall see, Mr. Finch, precisely how well that calculation serves him before a judge and jury. Prepare everything. I want Julian answering for every one of these £20 before the county assizes, and I want it done before the month is out. The county assize court at Salisbury filled early on the morning the case was called, word having spread through the county with the particular speed reserved for scandal touching a dukedom. Alistair had spent the fortnight since his return from London in close conference with Mr. Finch, building the case, stone by stone, from bank ledgers, parish records, and the reluctant testimony of a former workhouse clerk, who had, in the end, agreed to swear to what he remembered of that autumn payment in 1872. Julian, for his part, had retained a sharp London barrister, and arrived at the courthouse with the easy confidence of a man who still believed the matter would end exactly as he had planned it, with a nameless girl too frightened to speak in her own defense, and a jury inclined to believe a lord over a workhouse stray. Iris sat beside Alistair in the front gallery, dressed not in the plain gray wool she had worn at Ashwood, but in a gown of deep blue silk Mrs. Danvers had sent down from the manor for the occasion, her fair hair, dressed properly, for the first time since he had known her. She looked, Alistair thought, watching her from the corner of his eye, entirely unlike the trembling girl who had frozen before Mr. Holloway's iron cuffs 6 weeks before, though he knew well enough that the fear had not left her, only that she had decided, somewhere in the quiet weeks at St. Ives, to stand up inside it rather than be buried by it a second time. The prosecution's case, presented first by Julian's barrister, was polished and confident. The brooch discovered in Iris's own wardrobe, a workhouse girl of no established name or family, suddenly elevated to a duke's household, under circumstances the barrister described, with practiced delicacy, as difficult to account for by any innocent explanation. Julian sat through it with the satisfied stillness of a man watching a debt finally collected. Then Iris was called to the witness stand. A murmur passed through the gallery as she rose and crossed the courtroom, her step steady, despite the weight of every eye upon her. She took the oath in a clear voice, and Alistair, watching from the gallery with his hands gripping the rail before him, felt something in his chest loosen that had been drawn tight since the moment Julian's cousin first walked into Ashwood's drawing room with a magistrate at his heel. "State your name for the court," the judge instructed. "Iris Vance," she said, and the name carried through the courtroom with a certainty that silenced whatever whispers had followed her to the stand. Daughter of Arthur and Margaret Vance, of Ashwood Parish, Somerset. Under careful questioning from Mr. Finch, who had been permitted to assist the defense, given his months of investigation into the matter, Iris recounted what she remembered of the 14th of October, 1872, the carriage, the flooded river, the cold closing over her head, the fisherman who had pulled her half-drowned from the shallows below Compton Weir. She spoke of the fever that had taken her memory and her voice together, of the parish that had sent her to St. Jude's rather than trouble itself with a nameless, silent girl, and of the years that followed in which silence had seemed the only safety available to her. Julian's barrister rose for cross-examination with the confidence of a man expecting an easy collapse. "You ask this court to believe, Miss Vance, was it, that you have recovered, after a decade of silence, a memory conveniently detailed enough to name yourself the daughter of a man whose estate now carries considerable value? Is it not rather more likely that the Duke of Ashwood's kindness, and perhaps his solicitor's ambition, has supplied you with a history rather better suited to his purposes than the truth?" "It is not memory alone that names me, sir," Iris answered, and her voice did not waver, though her hands, Alistair noticed, gripped the rail of the witness box until her knuckles paled. "It is a payment of £20 made 3 days after my family's carriage went into the river, paid by Lord Julian Ashwood to an assistant overseer at St. Jude's workhouse, to ensure that whichever half-drowned girl arrived there that autumn was never recorded under her true name, nor connected to a family the county had already given up for dead. It is a workhouse clerk's sworn recollection of that arrangement, and it is a brooch found in my wardrobe at Ashwood Manor, in a room I had occupied for less than a fortnight, planted there by a valet, in service to a man who stood to lose a fortune in land and mineral rights the moment my identity was proven in a court such as this one." A ripple of astonishment moved through the gallery. Julian's composed stillness cracked visibly for the first time, his color draining as every eye in the courtroom turned toward him. "I did not learn to read a ledger in a workhouse laundry, sir," Iris continued, before the barrister could recover his footing, "but I have learned, since my rescue, precisely how such figures are traced, and precisely what they reveal about a man's fear of losing what he has already gambled away twice over. I do not ask this court to take my memory alone as proof. I ask it to weigh that memory against £20 paid in secret, a sapphire brooch conveniently discovered, and a decade of silence purchased at the cost of a stolen name." The courtroom held its breath through the long silence that followed. Julian's barrister, finding no ground left to stand upon, requested a brief recess with his client, and it was granted with visible reluctance by a judge whose expression had already settled into something considerably less than sympathy for the prosecution's case. When the court reconvened an hour later, it was not Iris who faced further questioning, but Lord Julian himself, summoned to answer for a ledger entry, a workhouse payment, and a fortune he had spent 10 years believing safely buried beneath a drowned girl's silence. Lord Julian Ashwood did not survive his hour on the witness stand with any of the composure he had carried into the courtroom that morning. Pressed by the judge to account for the £20 paid to St. Jude's workhouse 3 days after the Vance family's carriage went into the Avon, he offered first a vague claim of charitable donation, then a stammering assertion that he had no memory of the payment at all, an answer the workhouse clerk's sworn testimony, still fresh in the jury's ears, made impossible to credit. His own valet, Pratt, called to answer for the brooch's discovery, proved a considerably less loyal servant under oath than he had appeared at Ashwood, and by the time the second recess was called, the man had confessed, white-faced and stumbling, to placing the heirloom in Iris's wardrobe on Lord Julian's express instruction the night before the search. The jury did not require long to deliberate. When the court reconvened for the final time that afternoon, the judge dismissed every charge against Iris Vance without qualification, his remarks from the bench noting, with evident distaste, that the court had rarely seen a case built so entirely on fabricated evidence and purchased silence. He ordered the immediate arrest of Lord Julian Ashwood and his valet on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and the corruption of a public officer, and directed that the matter of the Vance land entitlement be referred without delay to the appropriate chancery proceedings, there being no longer any doubt, in the eyes of the law, as to the identity of the woman who stood to inherit it. Julian was led from the courtroom between two constables, his fine coat and his easy confidence both equally stripped from him, and he did not look at his cousin as he passed. Alistair, for his part, found he felt less triumph in the moment than he had expected, only a tired, aching relief, and beside him, Iris's hand slipping into his own as the courtroom finally released its held breath into a low, astonished murmur of conversation. News of the trial traveled through the county faster than the carriage that carried them home, and by the time Alistair and Iris returned to Ashwood, the story had already been embroidered a dozen different ways in a dozen different drawing rooms. The workhouse girl who had proven herself a lady before a judge and jury, the Duke who had risked his own name to protect her, the cousin dragged away in irons for a decade of buried cruelty. Mrs. Danvers wept openly on the front steps when the carriage arrived, and the whole household staff, gathered in the entrance hall to receive them, greeted Iris not as a guest this time, nor even as a survivor, but with the particular warmth reserved for one of their own, returned safely home. It was decided, in the weeks that followed, that Ashwood would host a ball for Valentine's week, not merely to celebrate the season, though the timing suited that purpose well enough, but to settle, once and for all, the question of Iris Vance's place in society. Alistair would introduce her formally, publicly, before every family of consequence in the county, and there would be no more whispered doubts, no more workhouse gossip trailing after her like a shadow she had not earned. The ballroom at Ashwood had not seen such splendor since Eleanor's own coming out a decade before. Great branches of hothouse flowers stood banked along the walls, chandeliers blazed with 100 candles apiece, and the orchestra, engaged from Bath at considerable expense, tuned their instruments in the gallery above while the first carriages began arriving up the long drive in the blue February dusk. Iris stood before the looking-glass in her south wing chamber, as Mrs. Danvers fastened the last clasp of her gown. A deep sapphire silk, chosen, Alistair had told her with a private smile, to match a certain brooch that had caused them both no small amount of trouble. Her hair was dressed high, a single strand of pearls at her throat, and the scar at her temple, which she had once tried so hard to hide beneath ragged hair and workhouse silence, caught the candlelight now without apology, a mark of survival rather than shame. "You look every inch the lady your father would have wished you to be," Mrs. Danvers said, her voice thick, and Iris found she could not answer for a moment, her throat tight with an emotion too large and too long overdue for easy words. Alistair was waiting for her at the foot of the great staircase when she descended, and the assembled guests below, dukes and countesses and county gentry, who had, not so very long ago, whispered of a nameless workhouse stray behind their fans, fell into a hush that was, this time, entirely admiring. "Lady Iris Vance," Alistair said, offering his arm, his voice carrying clear across the hall for every guest to hear. "Rightful heiress of the Vance estate, and, should she consent to it, my future duchess." She placed her hand in his, and together they descended into the ballroom's golden light, guests parting before them, murmurs of approval following in their wake where once there had only been suspicion. The orchestra struck up a waltz as they took the floor together, and Alistair drew her into the dance with the easy assurance of a man who had, at last, nothing left in the world to fear losing. Around them the ballroom spun in a blur of candlelight and silk, familiar faces and old titles bowing where they had once looked away, and through it all Iris kept her eyes fixed on his, the two of them turning slowly through the crowd as though the rest of Ashwood had fallen away entirely. "Ali," she whispered, close enough now that only he could hear it, her voice steady, sure, carrying none of the fear that had once made her guard every word as though it might be taken from her. "I love you. I have loved you, I think, since the moment you opened that watch and I saw my own family's grief reflected back at me in yours. And you," he murmured against her hair, though it took a workhouse, a river, and a very great deal of trouble to bring us both to admitting it. She laughed then, soft and unguarded, a sound that carried no trace of silence left in it at all, and as the waltz turned them once more beneath the blazing chandeliers, Lady Iris Vance spoke her love aloud for all the world to hear, in a voice that would never, ever be silenced again.